This video is kind of a little mini course on how to work with veneer. I'm going to be covering how you cut it, how to joint veneer, how to seam veneer. I'm going to talk quite a bit about understanding what kind of glue to use for veneering. I'm also going to go into a fair bit of detail on how the vacuum press works. I'm going to demonstrate gluing veneer to a substrate. I'm going to demonstrate how you would then remove the veneer tape off of the substrate after you've removed it from the press. And finally, we'll talk about sanding veneer. Hopefully this will give you a pretty good overview of how you work with veneer if you're thinking of getting into this, maybe considering investing in a vacuum press. This will give you a pretty good idea of how all that's done. So here is some African mahogany veneer that I purchased online from certainlywood.com. I purchased most of my veneer from these guys, and they're very high quality veneer at reasonable prices. And as you can see, this mahogany is about 7 inches wide, about 9 feet or so long. And just to give you an idea how thin this stuff is, it's about a 42nd of an inch thick. So in order to veneer a project, we have to glue this down on a substrate and join it together. So I'll show you what the end result is going to be. So here is a veneer skin. It's called a skin at this point, that's been edge jointed together using veneer tape. And I got to this stage by very precisely jointing the edges and then using this tape to hold the veneer together. I'm going to flip it over in the next shot so you can see what the underside looks like. This is actually the show surface. So the surface with the tape on it is what you'll ultimately look at. This is the glue surface, but it gives you a really good idea of what the show surface will look like eventually. And after it's been properly cut and jointed together, these seams all virtually disappear and it looks like one solid piece of mahogany. Pretty spectacular stuff. So since veneer is only a 42nd of an inch thick or so, you don't need a huge amount of power equipment to cut it, although I will be using power equipment in this demonstration. Depending on what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, other tools can be used to cut the veneer. These are a couple of different veneer saws. These are classical veneer saws. This is a Japanese version and this is a European version. And as you can see, this is what I use most of the time. This will ride along a fence and we'll make a cut like so. Same basic principle with this guy. And then we have a surgical scalpel, and sometimes I use this fabric cutter. This turns out to be a pretty versatile tool. And sometimes I also use paper cutter, which I'll be demonstrating in this particular video. I use lots and lots of blue tape for different operations, and I use veneer tape. Veneer tape is a white paper tape that is coated with one side of animal hide glue, and when you get it wet, it will stick like crazy to the veneer, and as it dries it shrinks slightly, which has the tendency to pull joints together. So you'll see that in a second. But I'm going to take one sheet of the veneer, which I've already marked. Paper, find my mark. Just easier said than done. Line my edge, so I'm making roughly a 90-degree cut, and I simply slice it. Here's the mark. 0.1 is just hiding. So my next layup is going to need 6 of these. So I've got 2 cut. I have to cut 4 more, and we'll go to the next step. So the next step is going to be to try to create a perfect edge joint. Now this is the raw veneer that I just cut, and in this particular case it's reasonably straight, but it's not perfect, and it's really no different than what you'd have to do if you were joining 2 solid boards together. You'd want to joint each edge so that they're perfectly straight and square to each other so you could glue it together. Well, in this particular case, you can see I've got it closed over here, but opens up as you go down that length, that end over there. So I have to joint all these together. And I learned a trick from one of the guys who taught me how to do this, Paul Schurtz out of California, using the Festool. So I'm going to demonstrate how to create perfect edge joints in veneer using the Festool saw. I need to point out that there are many ways of joining veneer together, and what I'm going to be showing you is only one particular technique for joining veneer. I would also point out that this technique is very, very good for joining long pieces of veneer together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take some blue tape and create a packet by taping the ends together. And this is going to do nothing but keep it from moving around as I perform this next operation. So I'm just trying to just stabilize it a little bit. I'm going to take both ends. This is also a good way to store your veneer. As a matter of fact, veneer can tear very easily, and so if you put a piece of tape across the end of each piece of veneer this way, it tends to almost eliminate that tearing that can sometimes happen. So now, let's do that to the other side. Okay. So now I'm going to start with this side, and these are all pretty good alignment. And I've got a defect that goes right to here, so I'm going to set. I'm going to by eye get it kind of parallel to the edge. Make my first cut. So I've got a brand new blade in my saw, and this blade is dedicated to only cutting veneer. And I've got the depth set so it's just going to barely cut into the MDF that we're sitting on. And I'm actually going to climb cut. I'm going to go backwards. And that's the best way to prevent this from chipping out. So here we go. Start at the edge. Okay, so that's one edge. Those fell off, but that's okay. So now I've got one edge that's perfect, and now I'm going to take a ruler. So because of that defect, I lost a little bit of width. So what can I get out of this? So I think I'm going to probably go for 5 3/4 of an inch. I want to get these parallel, just like any other board that you're trying to edge glue. So I'm going to make a mark at 5 3/4 of an inch here. 5 3/4 of an inch here. It's late fall and the flies are coming into the shop. They don't like the cooler weather outside, so they do that at their peril. Alright. And there we go. I have perfect edge joints that I can use to join these boards together, and I'll show you that next. I don't know how well this is going to show up on the camera, but I now have a perfect joint, and if I pull these together, I hope you can see that the joint virtually disappears along the length of the wood. So that's what we're after. And now I need to use veneer tape or gum tape to hold these together in position. So the way I do this is I cut a small piece off. I'm going to squeeze these together, apply pressure in both directions, lay the tape on here, take a brass brush. Brass brush is another trick I learned from Paul Church. It has a tendency to embed the tape into the wood, makes it stick a lot better. So again, I'll just squeeze it together. As this water evaporates from the tape, the paper will shrink slightly, pulling the joint together much tighter. Sometimes this joint is so perfect that if you're not careful, you can actually have a great deal of difficulty finding the joint, because what I have to do next, now that I'm sort of stitching this together, I'm going to run a piece of veneer tape across the joint in this direction. The technique I'm showing you is really only possible because the Festool does an incredible job creating a perfect joint. If I had cut this joint by hand, it's pretty unlikely that I'd be able to this easily pull this together. So in that case, another technique you can use is to use blue tape, blue painter's tape, on one side, stitch everything together with that tape. When you're happy everything is how it is, you turn it over and then apply the gum tape to the joint, flip it back over again, remove the blue tape. That's actually how I started doing this years ago. It's a much easier method for a beginner to do it that way, because especially if you haven't got an absolutely perfect joint. But if you do a bunch of these, you kind of get the hang of it. Your fingers learn when you've got just the right amount of pressure on the joint. And you can skip the blue tape phase. If you get the joint right, this whole process will go very smoothly. I will say one thing about working with veneer. Well, there's a number of advantages to it. Not the least of which is that virtually any species of wood that you would never find in solid wood, because it's gotten to be so scarce, is available as veneer. The other thing I would say is that oftentimes lumber companies will set aside the finest logs for veneering purposes. So wood with beautiful grainy figure often is reserved for it's stitched together. And I'm going to take one long piece. Cover the entire joint. Stuff's a little difficult to work with, but once you get the hang of it, it's not too bad. And the hardest part, like I said, is to make sure you're actually covering the joint with the tape. Once it's down like this, it's pretty well down. Alright. Now I'll flip this over so you can see the joint virtually disappears. So I'm going to continue this process and stitch together a piece that's wide enough for the MDF blanks that I've got made up. Okay, let's take a minute to talk about glue and the proper glue to use to glue veneer. This is Elmer's Glue All, a white glue. It's my go-to glue. I've been using it for 25 years for the vast majority of my glue-up tasks. It's a great glue for gluing joints together, for edge gluing, and all sorts of woodworking tasks. It's not, however, suited for gluing veneer to a substrate. And the biggest reason why this doesn't work, there's two reasons. I use a vacuum press to press my my veneer, and Elmer's glue is designed to cure by evaporation. And since I'm going to be putting this glue in a vacuum press, I'll be taking all of the air out of the bag, which is going to result in no place for the evaporation to go. So as a result, Elmer's glue doesn't really want to set up properly in the vacuum bag. There are other ways of doing it, of course, by clamping it and different methods that don't involve vacuum, and it will work for that, except that Elmer's glue is a semi-rigid glue joint. In other words, for the vast majority of woodworking applications, the rigidity of the glue, once it completely cures, is more than adequate to hold most joints together. But for veneer requires a rigid glue joint, and it also requires a glue that works well in a vacuum. So I use a product called Unibond 1, and there's another cousin of Unibond 1 called Unibond 800. This particular glue is available from Woodcraft and other sources online. And Unibond 1 is a rigid glue, so when it dries, it's almost like a piece of glass. There's no give to it, no movement at all. And it's perfect for gluing or fixing a piece of veneer down to a substrate that's not going to move. So I use MDF as my substrate. For all intents and purposes, MDF is it doesn't really dimensionally change with moisture conditions, at least not appreciably, relative to the veneer. So the idea is I want to clamp this veneer down. I want to attach this veneer to the surface of this rigid piece of substrate that's not going to move. So if the veneer does try to move because of seasonal changes in moisture, it's just not going to go anyplace. So this is a very effective glue for veneers. There's a number of these that are also known as cold press veneers. You can find them in different sources. Different vendors sell different brands of this, but I prefer Unibond 1. Its cousin Unibond 800 is based on a family of urea formaldehyde glues. It's a two-part glue that comes with a resin and a powder catalyst, and it's a little trickier to mix together. It's very fussy in terms of mixing the catalyst in with the with the rest of the mixture, and you've got to stir it and wait and stir it and wait, and it's kind of a fussy thing to do. Plus, it's very temperature sensitive. But Unibond 800 is part of the family of glues that's actually used to make commercial plywood, so it will set under the presence of heat. So I don't have a hot press, but some people who work with veneer do, and certainly plywood manufacturers do have hot presses. So they'll put this Unibond 800 variant of glue, this urea formaldehyde glue, down, heat it up in a press, and within a couple of minutes the glue is set, and it works great. The one glue I want to warn you against using at all is good old contact cement. Now, it drives me crazy when I see so-called expert woodworkers on TV shows showing you that you can use contact cement to glue veneer down to a substrate. There's a couple reasons why this is a really bad idea. First of all, contact cement is a rubbery type of a glue. It never really forms anything even close to a rigid glue line. Secondly, it was designed for mica or a non-porous substrate or non-porous product to be adhered to a piece of MDF or other type of pressed wood or plywood. So the fact that it's intended to be used with a substrate, with a laminate that is not porous, means that when you adhere contact cement, when you adhere veneer with contact cement, there's a good possibility that when you go to finish the piece, some of that finish is going to leach through the very thin veneer. It's only a 42nd of an inch thick, and it's going to interfere with the glue bond, and eventually it'll fail. So anything you're doing that's you intend to make a long-term heirloom type of a project, you don't want to use contact cement. Contact cement should be used for what its intended purpose was. So that's kind of the basics of glue, and I'm going to be using Unibond 1 for this particular project. Unibond 1 is a great glue for doing just panel glue-ups, very simple glue-ups. If I was doing a marquetry piece, I would probably go with Unibond 800. There's a number of rules of thumb that people use depending on which one to choose, and it has a lot to do with the type of environment the project can end up being in, and so on and so forth. And I'm not really going to get into that, but if you're a beginner, I would highly advise that you either use something like a Unibond 1 or any of the cold press glues designed for veneering that you'll find on the web. So I thought I'd take you on a little tour of the vacuum press and explain to you how this thing works. This is a vacuum pump made by Vacuum Press out of Vermont, and it has two modes of operation. It can automatically cycle, or it can be continuously drawing a vacuum. And so connected to the pump is a hose, and one end of the hose plugs into the back of the pump, and the other end is designed to be inserted through the bag, and you'll see this in a second, through one of these things, which is like a plastic grommet of sorts that this will fit into, and this will actually go through the bag and into this. And here I can show you how this thing works. So what you do is you take a piece of melamine, and the first step to do is to drill a hole about an inch or so from the end of the melamine that's large enough to accommodate this little plug, and you insert it from the bottom, and then you take a saw and you cut it flush with the surface, and then you cut a number of kerfs through this little plastic piece and make these squares effectively. And what's going to happen is the vacuum hose is coming up through the bottom, through the bag, and will go into here, into this hole, draw a vacuum, and these little slots, if you will suck out the air from the entire bag and draw a vacuum down on the part that you're pressing. So that's sort of the basic theory of operation. I've got a number of these pieces of melamine in different various sizes. It really depends on the size bag you've got, what size melamine piece you're going to use. This one tends to be the one I go to the most. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet or so. That tends to accommodate the vast majority of the panels that I glue up. I've got a couple smaller ones, and I've got a really big one that I can press an entire large tabletop on. So these are things that you accumulate over time. I would also say that this probably looks pretty expensive to you if you're looking to get into vacuum pressing. It is expensive, at least this particular equipment is, but there are much less expensive options available from various sources on the internet if you just want to get started and try doing this. You can spend a lot less money on this. This is probably what I'm going to be showing you in this video. It's probably $1,200, maybe 10, 11, 12 years ago. So in today's market, it's going to be a little more expensive than that, but you can get into this for a lot less money. You can make your own vacuum pump, you can make your own vacuum bag. There's a lot of ways to save quite a bit of money and get into this. So this is the box that my vacuum bag came in many years ago, and it makes for a very nice place to store it. So I'll show you how this thing gets set up. So bag has got a opening on one side and everything else is sealed up. This bag is a polyurethane bag. And there's a couple of different bags you can get. Polyurethane is one variant of it. And then there's also a less expensive, I think it's PVC, that's available as well. But the polyurethane is quite a bit more money, but it lasts and lasts and lasts. This bag is at least 12 years old, and I can't even begin to guess how many glue-ups I've done in it. And it still works like a champ. So I happen to have a little table here that's the height, it works out perfectly, and I put my vacuum press on this table, and this is just high enough above it that I can very gingerly and carefully slide the platen inside the bag. And you just have to be careful. I should also point out that this has got, all the edges have been eased with the chamfering bit, so there's no sharp edges or sharp corners on this bag. Around this, anything that goes into the vacuum press, you have to take care of the corners. You have to be sure that the corners are not sharp so that they don't pierce the bag, because this bag will be under tremendous pressure. This was that piece of plastic I was talking about earlier, and on the bottom of the bag is a little plastic nipple, and I want to get these close to being lined up. As close as I can get it. That's pretty close. Yeah, right about there. Okay, so now I've got the platen in the bag. I'm going to have to connect the vacuum hose through the bag into the platen. So I want to reach underneath the bag and insert this nipple through plastic down the bag and move the whole thing out just a little bit. job one is to get it through the bag, and then next I've got to get it actually into plastic insert. For that I might have to fuss with it a little bit. I think I'm just about there. Okay, so the hose now is going through the bag into that plastic insert, and I'm going to connect the other end of the. So the vacuum bag is set up. It has been stored. I've got a lot of work put into the veneer skins and everything. The last thing I want is to put the glue on this stuff, stick it in the bag and discover that I've got a leak. So I always do a test run with the vacuum press before I even start doing glue up. So this is part of the clamping system. There's a round plastic rod and some little snaps. And the idea is you take this piece of plastic, which is like a C, you start at one end and you basically squeeze this around the plastic tube in the bag. This was a lot easier when I was younger, before I developed arthritis in my fingers. So I'm creating a near perfect seal. I have to be careful that this thing doesn't run on me, which it just did. It's always good to do a dry run before you actually have glue on it, so you get re-familiarized with the thing, because this thing might sit in the box for a few months, and then I'll drag it out and do a glue up, and getting yourself reacquainted with how it works, what's the difficult parts, so you kind of got a feel for it. Even though I've had this for years, it seems to be a good thing to do. Okay, so now I've sealed this end of the bag. Now I'm going to turn the press on and I'm going to draw a vacuum, even though there's nothing in the vacuum press. I'm going to draw a vacuum and let it sit for a while. And if there's any leaks that develop in the bag, now's the time to find them before I actually start doing my glue up. And like I said, I've had this bag, I think 12 years, hundreds of glue ups. I've never had a leak in it, but it's gonna leak at some point, so I'd rather find that out sooner than later. So I turn the vacuum press on. It's running the vacuum through the hose, through this little hole, sucking the air out of all these little grooves in the bag, and you can see the bag going down. Draws the vacuum, the pump is working harder and harder and harder to put the air out. Eventually, it'll stop. There. So now I've drawn a vacuum inside this bag, and I don't hear any hissing, I don't hear anything that would give me any reason to believe there's a problem with the bag. So it's okay now to go ahead and start my glue up. Okay, I have here some pieces of the mahogany veneer that I'm going to glue up into finishing samples. So I'm going to make a couple of these with the veneer on both sides, and I can try different finishes to get the one I'm looking to achieve. I decided to show you this as a glue up, not the actual tabletop, because the actual tabletop is a very large, very untypical glue up, and it was very difficult. It took a couple people to do it, and most people that are watching this video are probably not going to attempt something that big. It's the first project anyway. So this is going to give you a pretty good idea of what's going to happen here. So what we're going to end up with is I like to use melamine as like a clamping caul, if you will. And so there's going to be a piece of veneer on the bottom, and I made this clamping caul, these cauls just about 1/2 inch in each dimension bigger than the substrate. So there'll be a piece of veneer like that, one like this, and then another clamping caul like this, and then this whole thing's going to go into the vacuum press. But before I do that, I have to ease these corners. So I just have a rasp and knock these corners off with, because I don't want these corners piercing my vacuum bag. And these corners are very sharp when you're putting as much pressure on them as we're going to be putting on the vacuum bag. So I just kind of knock them off like that, and I'm going to make my sandwich like so. So I'm going to actually glue up 2 of these at one time, and I may end up gluing a couple more if I can't get a finish I'm happy with. But next we'll go through the process of how we do this glue up. Okay, so I have here the 2 pieces of substrate, and I have my Unibond 1 adhesive, and I've got an inexpensive foam roller that I'm going to use to actually spread the glue. It takes a little bit of looking to find a roller that works really well. I'm just going to butt these 2 together so it's easier to spread and do 2 at once than it is to do them 1 at a time. I'm going to be a little more sparing with the glue this time. About that much here. You're looking to get a coat of glue on that's roughly the consistency of latex paint. So if you were painting this MDF, you're kind of looking for that sort of consistency. There's enough color in the glue that you can easily determine when you've got a good covering. So this is really what I'm looking for. Same thing with this guy. Highly recommend you put down paper. This can be a messy process. I should have put gloves on. I usually do. Okay, so that's pretty good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the other sheet of veneer on my substrate. I'm going to slide it off a little bit and get these to all line up. What can happen in the vacuum press is the veneer can actually slide around and move. So I use Scotch cellophane tape. When I get the veneer positioned where I want it to be, I'll just put a piece of tape on it to hold it. Now that tape will come off. It can be a bit of a challenge to get it off, but it definitely keeps the veneer from sliding around. Okay, so that one's ready to go. You can see the veneer has picked up some moisture from the glue and it's starting to curl. But that's okay because we're going to be clamping it in a second here. Do the same thing to this guy. Okay, so now they're both taped, and want to get them positioned so there's about 1/4 inch exposure all around. The reason you use melamine is that the glue really doesn't want to stick to the melamine. It might grab a little bit, but you can usually easily get it off without too much difficulty. If you don't use melamine, you can use MDF as a caul, but you have to separate it with plastic sheets. I do that often too. It just depends on the application. So now I've got these things prepared to go into the press. There's one last thing I need to do, and that's to put some blue tape on them to keep the top and the bottom caul from moving around. So I'm going to back the camera up a little bit and show you that. So I have some blue tape, and all this stuff is going to do is kind of hold these guys and keep it from sliding once it gets into the press. I kind of like to do something like this on one side, turn around, do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so here goes the first one. And here's the second one. I double check to make sure I've got my chamfered side facing up. So you can see that you can glue up several things at one time with a platen this size, or you can glue up one really big thing. So with the tabletops, well, they took up pretty much the whole thing. There's probably other types of closure systems that don't require that you be some kind of weightlifter. This is the one I've been used to and been using for a long time, and so if this bag ever fails and I have to replace it, I'll take a hard look at what's available in terms of more advanced closure systems. So we're almost there. Okay, so I've got my seal done. I'm going to turn on the vacuum press. You see the bag start to grab, go down. Quite a volume of air inside here. It takes a little bit of time to draw it all off. You see it starting to come down now. Watch, you start to see where it's going to curve down and form around it. It gets very tight very quickly. I can see that nothing is moving inside the vacuum bag, so I'm pretty happy with everything. So what's happening here, and the physics of this is kind of interesting, because you might think that drawing the air out of the bag is causing a suction somehow to suck this thing down and put all this pressure on it. But in fact, what's really happening is by removing the atmosphere from inside the bag, there's still atmosphere outside the bag. And imagine, if you will, there's a column of air this size going all the way up to the stratosphere, pressing down on this and on this. And depending on your altitude above sea level, that pressure is about 1,400 pounds per square foot where I'm at in the Midwest. If you're up in the Rockies in Aspen or something, you might be a lot less than that. But at sea level, at 1,400 pounds per square foot, it's almost impossible to achieve that kind of pressure in a home workshop anyway, without using a vacuum press. And so I'm going to let this sit in the vacuum press for 4 or 5 hours, something like that. Depending on the glue, different glues require a different amount of time they have to sit in the press. This is Unibond 1, Unibond 800. It's more industrial strength cousin. It actually takes a longer time to press, which might sound like a bad thing, but the other side of the coin is that it has a very, very, very long open time. So if you're fiddling with something and adjusting it, you can actually have a lot of time to get that adjusted just right until you finally get it in the press. This particular glue, the bottle says 2.5 hours. I'll let it go 4. And then sometimes when the shop gets cold, depending on the glue I'm using, I also have the heating blanket that I can cover this with. I turn it on high and I warm up the work that's being glued, and that extra warmth tends to help the glue set quicker. These glues have got a certain temperature range they're going to work at. If you're below that temperature range, it won't set. You'll take it out after 8 hours and it'll still be gummy and sticky. Correspondingly, the hotter it is, the quicker the glue will set. So above a certain point, you're fine. Below a certain point, the glue just won't work. So there's just some tips to keep in mind as if you ever try to do this. So this is going to set for a while, and we'll take it out after 4 hours and see what it looks like. So this panel is ready now to have the veneer tape removed. There's several ways to do this. Some people like to just sand it off. Some people use a sharpened card scraper to take it off. I have come to prefer a method involving some water, and a long time ago I found this particular paint scraper made by a company called Hyde, and it's a fairly thick, it's probably maybe 3/16 of an inch thick. It's a stiff steel, and it's got a rounded edge over here and then a flat edge. And I've actually taken this and flattened it further on my using some diamond stones. It's a little dirty now, but to get it really flat. You want it sharp, but you don't want it super sharp to the point where you're going to be cutting the wood. You want it to be able to get under the veneer and lift it. And that's the nice thing about this little curve that's on this blade, is that the veneer will kind of slide over it. I will take this over to my buffing wheel before I start and go over it and clean it up with the buffing wheel and polish it so it's a nice smooth surface. This particular paint scraper is made by Hyde. I'm not sure I could tell you which model it is, but maybe from the picture you can try to find something similar to it. It tends to work really well. This is an old envelope liquor that I got from Amazon. It was like $2. And the idea is, it's got a little sponge and it's soaked with water, is I'm going to put water on the top of the veneer tape. And the water is going to soak into the tape and reactivate the glue. And you can probably see how the tape is changing color and it's becoming somewhat translucent. You don't want a ton of water. I mean, you don't want to soak this thing. And you want to try to keep the water on top of the tape as best you can. Although, theoretically, once this glue sets, it should be basically waterproof. But I have had a couple of failures occur with actually the urea formaldehyde. I've had some failures occur with the Unibond 800 with marquetry, and everything was fine until we put water on it to remove the tape, and then it didn't go very well. So I'm going to take my scraper, and I can see it sort of turned translucent, and I'm just going to push it along like so and sort of lift an edge. And once I do that, if I have the right amount of moisture in it and it's set up long enough. So there's kind of a trick to this. You don't want to get it soaked, but it has to be moist. The moisture has to soak through the paper and reactivate the glue. So it's kind of a touchy-feely thing. You'll get the hang of it when you do it a little bit. So let's try this again. And wherever tape crosses tape, it can be a little more persnickety. Now you can see how nice it's pulling up. Like so. And the worst part about this stuff is it's still very, very sticky. And it's really hard to get off of your fingers. So I'm going to go ahead and do these guys next. I'm going to put some more water under the part that was covered just a while ago with the other veneer tape. Let it soak in again. And then come back with my scraper and get it started. Sometimes it comes up easy. Sometimes you got to fight it a little bit. Sometimes if you go at an angle, this seems to help. Kind of slicing like so. And now I should be able to just pull it right off. And occasionally you get some residuals that'll be left over like this. So I can just take and apply a little moisture to that. Let it sit there for a second, come back and get the next guy. By the time I get this one off, I can go back and get that one. That one came off clean. So there, this is coming off now just fine. So that's the basic process. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there was obviously a joint here. For all intents and purposes, the joint has disappeared. The only reason I can tell there's a joint is because I can sense a change in grain direction where they come together like this. Other than that, the joint is basically invisible. So the technique I showed you using the Festool Track Saw, climb cutting to create these joints, is for all intents and purposes bulletproof. I use it all the time whenever I'm doing large glue-ups like this. I wouldn't necessarily use that technique if I'm working on something small. There's other techniques for jointing veneer that are more appropriate for smaller pieces, but when you're doing large glue-ups like this, it's an excellent technique. So I'm going to go ahead and continue taking all the tape off, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about sanding this and getting it ready for finishing. Okay, for sanding this, I have a kind of a three-stage approach. First thing I'm going to do is use the Festool Rotex in the gentle sanding mode with 180 grit sandpaper on the bottom. And I'm going to use that to remove the majority of the glue that's left on here and any bits of paper or anything else like that. After I'm done with that, I've got this Makita half sheet sandpaper, which is a marvelous machine. And I'm going to use that with 220 grit sandpaper to put a very fine finish on it. And I'm going to finish up with 220 grit sandpaper with a hand sanding pad to kind of finesse it and make it look really, really pretty. So I'm not going to really make you watch all this because watching somebody sand is not very interesting, but I will show you the before and the after, and you can see the difference. I will tell you the best advice I ever got about sanding veneer was an instructor once told me to make up some samples, take your sandpaper, put it in your machine, whatever you're using, and sand and sand and sand and sand until you sand through the veneer. You've really got to have an understanding of how long and how much sanding you can do before you risk burning through the veneer. And the only way that I know of that you can do that is to actually make some sample pieces and ruin them, sand through them, and then you'll understand, what you can and cannot do with a power sander on veneer. So I'm going to go ahead and do this, and I'll come back and show you what it looks like in a couple minutes. I guess I will show you a little bit of the sanding so you can get an idea of how long I work with this 180 grit sandpaper to get rid of all of the little glue marks. Okay, so I worked fairly aggressively on this spot here, and I've gotten virtually all of the glue and tape residue off, and it's easy to see where I have not sanded yet. And so I'm just going to go ahead and continue with this rotary sander and keep on going until I get through the whole thing, and then I'm going to come back and follow it up with the half sheet pad sander. So now I'm going to go ahead and follow up with this 220 grit sandpaper on this half sheet inline sander, and this does a very nice job on large expanses of wood like this. It's a very good investment for me. Let the sander do the work. Doesn't take a ton of pressure. You work your way back and forth. Okay, so the last thing I like to do is come back with a hand sander. And I just think going over it with your hand is just the only way to get a really good sanding job. I can easily do the edges. You can see the nice job that the veneer blends into the solid edging that I put on this thing, and by the time I put the finish on it, it'll look like one solid piece of wood. Blends in very, very nicely. So, I've completed sanding this particular piece, and it looks very nice. The one thing that'll kind of both help you and fool you is, as you sand this, even with a really good system to take away the dust will get in these pores. It's kind of good because it can definitely tell you where you've sanded and where you've missed, and the bad news is it looks a lot better than it really looks. I'll eventually be filling this mahogany to try to get it back to this state. But right now, blow off. So now that you've watched this video, I hope you've picked up some useful tips and tricks, and I wish you the best wishes for your first or next veneering project. Thanks for watching.